William Wes Auger, a lead AP, has over 30 published articles as a contributing writer for the magazines Earth Odyssey and The Noise. He has worked as the educational coordinator for the Arcosanti Project, the Acosa Institute, and the Lost Valley Educational Center. Having taught over 200 students in his career, he has now compiled his lessons on permaculture design into one text, William's PDC, a permaculture design course. All original text and illustrations in his book to the intellectual property of William W. Auger. Permission is given to copy for educational and/or promotional purposes. Copyright August 2011. This book is dedicated to all of the pioneers who have and still are working hard to lay the foundations for a sustainable future. William's PDC, Permaculture Design Course, Table of Contents. The History of Non-Sustainability, page 10. The history of non-sustainability. When discussing how we became non-sustainable, I always point a square finger of blame at the international style of architecture as popularized by the Bauhaus School of Architecture and their contemporaries. It is the international style which has brought us an explosion of concrete, steel, brick, right-angled structures, the International Building Code, and the modern world as we understand it. The international style has resulted in an ecological and cultural catastrophe for the world, and it is important to understand the philosophy behind it and why it was embraced as a positive step forward for humanity. The international style was predominantly born in Europe. What many of these modern architects saw in European culture was a history of architecture being used to create aggrandized manors and castles to create a class stratified society. The structures allowed the ruling class to enjoy an opulent lifestyle and to hoard resources such as food, medicines, books, wealth, and weapons away from the masses. This was dressed up as classical European architecture. It can be easily and well argued that without this architectural paradigm, there could have been no monarchies as we understand them, as without the architecture to support it, they could not have created the fortresses necessary to enforce their rule. It is a matter of historical controversy, but some, myself included, believe that the Bauhaus architects and their contemporaries were driven by communist philosophy. It was their political aim to use architecture to change the European cultural paradigm. They sought an architecture that would eliminate class distinctions and create a society of equality with the highest possible standard of living for all. Regardless if they were exactly communist or not, their new form of architecture was literally the manifestation of their humanitarian philosophy. To create an architecture that would bring equality for all, they rejected the notions of regionalism and traditionalism in design. Based on their observations, they believed regional and traditional thinking held cultures back from embracing new concepts, keeping resource-poor areas in squalor, while enabling a decadent standard of living for resource-rich areas. With the rejection of regional and traditional design came the rejection of local resource use in architecture. Modern construction materials had to be shipped from far-off industrial centers, which required the creations of a massive transportation infrastructure. Modern designs did not allow for traditional cultural habits and lifestyles. Can you imagine a group of American Indians trying to have a powwow in the lobby of a modern-day apartment building? With the loss of these traditions, we also lost the wisdom of how to live best in harmony with the environment. One of the main functions of architecture is to create comfortable temperatures inside of the structure. Across the world and throughout time, cultures developed traditional architecture based on local materials and appropriate strategies to create these comfortable environments. With the rejection of regionalism and traditionalism by the international style, modern architecture has replaced environmental design wisdom with HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems that are made from industrialized materials and require electricity to run. Buildings are no longer comfortable by design. They are designed so that their comfort requires a constant input of electricity from a power plant that needs fuel to be constantly harvested and burned. The international style incorporated new feats in steel, concrete, glass, and chemical engineering to create industrially mass-produced construction materials. Along with these new industrialized materials came strip mining, deforestation, and an increased consumption of fossil fuels to both produce and transport these materials. Instead of living off their own resources and traditional livelihood, those plugged into modern architecture were now being paid to reap their own natural resources and send them away so that they could afford to purchase and power the modern architecture they had then been sold. Where imperial powers used to accomplish this with martial force, it was now being done with architecture. On an international scale, laws and government policies shifted, and this new modern standard of living was exported all across the globe. Not all of the architects associated with the international style came from the Bauhaus school. Also instrumental in the creation of the modern international style was the Swiss architect Le Caboosier. His main area of focus was on the design of a new type of urban environment based on these modern principles. He pretty much single-handedly created what we now know and recognize as the typical skyscraper and road grid-ridden metropolitan downtown. Ironically, his urban designs garnered a lot of criticism at the time and were rejected by his own culture, yet the basics of his design have become the template for the contemporary redesign of almost all major urban centers since his time. An unforeseen consequence of his design theory was that as commercial, business, industrial, and apartment complexes took over the city center, land prices became prohibitive to the concept of owning a homestead within the city. Seeing the death of the American homestead as a cultural travesty, American architect Lloyd Wright unveiled his design for Broadacre City, a design which called for single-family homes surrounded by a 1-acre plot of land for food production and a surrounding road grid to allow automobile access from the residents to far-off urban centers. These homes would be affordable because the land would be outside of the expensive city center. While Broadacre City only existed on paper, it presented an influential vision of how to develop housing to accommodate the newly returning GIs of World War II and the expanding baby boomer generation. In the early 1940s, the first modern suburb called Levittown was constructed. The land for the suburb was viable agricultural land near the city that was bought up and converted to land for housing, a trend that would become a standard strategy in suburban expansion. This strategy destroyed the local food resources of city after city and was the death knell of American agrarian and naturalistic culture. Levittown shared many design features with Wright's Broadacre City, but instead of an acre of viable gardening land, each home had a small yard filled with only lawns. Farmlands were pushed further and further away from the city, requiring petroleum-dependent food delivery infrastructures to feed the populations. As the suburbs extended out, they chewed up the ecosystems that ringed the cities, often being named after the very ecological features they destroyed, such as shady pines, hidden lakes, or oak woods. As the Levittown model proved financially viable, it spread ravenously, creating urban sprawl. Working together, the international style of architecture, Le Corbusier-inspired city centers, and the bastardized version of Broadacre City that was the urban sprawl of Levittown, created a resource hyper-consumptive system reliant on the automobile that destroyed both food security and local ecologies and caused a cultural degeneration. This perfect storm of well-intended but destructive architecture is not the only factor that has created our modern, non-sustainable world. You cannot determine the sustainability of a society without looking at how they produce their food. The current philosophy of the modern architecture of food production is based on the Green Revolution, an agricultural revolution started in the late 50s and early 60s to increase the world food supply. This revolution had some philosophical similarities with the development of the international style of architecture. This revolution depended on abandoning regional and traditional food sources and relying on the application of modern industrial improvements to food production. One of the strategies of the Green Revolution was to repurpose the war industry left from World War II into a food industry. It was literally a swords to plowshares card. Chemical plants that produced explosive gunpowder could be modified to produce fertilizer. That's why Timothy McVeigh was able to buy fertilizer and blow up a building with it. Assembly lines that produced tanks could be retooled to produce combines and heavy machinery. Chemical weapons were modified to become herbicides and pesticides. Such a massive shift in food production was financially viable because much of the infrastructure was already in place and paid for by the war generation, who helped by doing such things as recycling metal and rubber and growing their own food in victory gardens. By the application of large-scale machinery, row farming, chemical fertilizers, chemical herbicides, and pesticides, food production could be engineered to produce greater yields. Later came the application of laboratory-driven genetic engineering to modify plant yields. These improvements did drastically increase the exportable food supply of modernized countries, and many believe this panacea of food was one of the major factors why the world population spiked. These new food systems have caused massive ecological impacts. all negative. The massive monocrop fields that stretch out over the horizon destroy local ecologies. The chemical runoffs pollute local water tables. The systems burn out the nutrient cycle in the local soil, requiring higher and higher chemical inputs. And the food production systems are completely dependent on gas-powered vehicles and equipment. With this came the destruction of local ecologies, resource hyperconsumption, and the destruction of hundreds of generations of tried and true cultural ecological wisdom. In addition to all of this, one of the main culprits in creating a non-sustainable world was the invention of waste, one of the few true human inventions. Synthetics, as well as perfectly natural materials that could decompose, such as paper, wood, and food, are dumped in ways that do not allow them to decompose. The ecology is an inherently upcycling process. That is, it gets stronger over time. But by the creation of waste, we are downcycling the ecology, making it weaker and weaker as time goes on. So we can see that we are non-sustainable due to our architecture and infrastructure. It is quite obvious that to become sustainable, we need to change our architecture and infrastructures. However, our current architecture and infrastructures are expressions of philosophical systems about humans should live on the planet that believe we should use engineering and industry rather than ecological wisdom to provide our standard of living. While it may seem that I'm being very critical of the philosophy of the modern era, that is far from the truth. With the exception that Levittown was for whites only, the international style of architecture, the Green Revolution, and even the development of suburbs all began from very humanitarian positions that I agree with. These design paradigms were created by people attempting to provide food, housing, and improve lifestyles for all equally. What the design concepts of these systems missed was a philosophical system based on the notion of how humanity should live in accordance with the environment. This is where permaculture design comes in, providing a design system that is ethically similar to those that have guided the modern era, yet integrating a belief that humans should live in harmony with the fluctuations of nature. Where the modern age rejects the notion of regionalism and traditionalism, permaculture calls to incorporate regionalism, traditionalism, ecological wisdom, as well as modern thinking into one design paradigm. For example, aquaponics systems are a modern technology, yet they are completely permaculture. From a permaculture point of view, the Arcosanti project is in many ways a modern American Indian Pueblo. So don't yet reject any of the things from the modern era. Rather, hold on to them, and after reading this book, refocus them through this new lens, a permaculture lens. Recommended reading: Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed by Jared Diamond. The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs and Jason Epstein. Thank you.